Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this show, which is designed to give us all a little bit more insight into the goings-on in our state government in and around our state capital. Our guest for this program is a gentleman who has been in state government for many years. Sometimes his looks belie that. A gentleman who has been dedicated to working for and with the children of the state. And I'm referring to Rick Hill. Welcome.
Thank you.
We've got a little bit of a program approach that I take where I try to build up a little bit about a person's background. But first, I should mention your position. You're the Acting Director of Juvenile Corrections, which you've been since 1992. And I'm perplexed about the Acting Director situation. Can you explain that?
Well, in Children's Services Division, which is part of DHR, when someone is elevated to a higher position, there's often a chain reaction of promotions behind that. And I'm currently caught up in one of those chain reactions, and it's really not up to me to say what's going to happen next, but we all just do the best we can.
So you've been Acting Director of Juvenile Corrections for almost 2 years now.
Yes.
But going back, and this is where I want to pick up a little bit of history, you've been working for Children's Services Division almost throughout your professional career. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done over the years with Children's Services Division?
Well, just prior to this position, Kevin, I was the superintendent at McLaren School, and I've been working with the delinquent side of CSD going all the way back to 1974. I've had increasingly responsible management positions. I worked at Hillcrest for a while. I supervised the juvenile camp system for 4 years. I was a supervisor with the parole unit, and I actually started as a parole officer back in 1974.
Now, back in 74, when you started out as a parole officer, you had an undergraduate degree. Can you tell us a little bit about that education?
Well, I had a bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Wisconsin, where I grew up. I got involved in working with the youth here in Oregon and decided that I liked the field and I wanted to learn more about it. So I went to the University of Portland at night school, and got a master's degree in criminal justice.
Did you get that about 77?
Yes, 1977. And that was on a LEAP grant, or a law enforcement assistance program grant.
Now, what made you decide that you enjoyed working with juveniles?
Well, when I first came to Oregon, which was 1971, I was working with adult offenders. My job was to find jobs for releasees from the penitentiary. I did that for 3 years, and after 3 years of that, I thought that, well, maybe there's something a little bit more optimistic that I need to be doing with my life.
When you refer to that, are you referring to the unfortunate statistics that we have about the repeat offense rate for ex-cons?
I found them to be very, very difficult to work with. Even if we were successful at finding employment for them and getting them released and setting them up with a living place, the staying power of those individuals was very, very short, and I kept seeing the same clients over and over again, and that was very discouraging.
Now, on the juvenile side, do you see a little bit different dynamic?
I think what the public sees, or what the public reads about with juvenile violence today, it's very shocking. But if you look real hard at some of the statistics, you'll see that we're actually doing a much better job with kids than we are with adults, particularly in Oregon.
Now, before we get too far into that, I also wanted to touch a little bit on your family side. You're married?
I am.
And do you have a child?
Mary and I have one child. His name is Ryan, and he's a 6th grader at Fayrite Elementary, and my wife teaches school at McKinley.
What kind of activities do you get into on the side when you're not dealing with juvenile issues for the state?
Well, I'm involved with the Boy Scout troop my son is a member of. I've been involved with Little League. Our theory of raising a child is to keep them as busy as possible and enroll them in as many activities as we can find.
Has it worked?
It has so far.
Do you follow up on that theory in your work in Children's Services Division and Juvenile Corrections?
Yes. When we're planning programs for kids who come to our custody, we try to organize programs that are very, very intensive so that there isn't a lot of idle time during the day.
Let's talk a little bit about the structure of juvenile corrections. And this is something that folks probably aren't too familiar with. I mean, we have a Department of Corrections, but that's for adult offenders. And we have a Department of Human Resources, and within that, the Children's Services Division. Now, how does juvenile corrections fit in with that?
Well, going all the way back to 1891, McLaren School was founded in Oregon. It's called the Oregon, it wasn't called McLaren, it was called the Industrial School or something like that. And juvenile corrections eventually became part of the adult corrections system when that was formed. And then in 1971, when Children's Services Division was formed, all programs that dealt with children went into that organization, and that's part of DHR.
Now, in terms of the programs and philosophy, you mentioned that we had the forerunner of McLaren running back to 1891. In those days, were we dealing with the kind of youthful offenders that people think about, that is the violent criminals, or were we dealing with errant children, so to speak, who had to be taken care of in an institutional setting? What kind of a client base did they have back then?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, because we recently had our centennial celebration at McLaren after 100 years of operation, and we researched some of the backgrounds of the early commitments. The very first student to be committed to McLaren was from Multnomah County, and he was committed for stealing a newspaper, the Oregonian newspaper, off the front steps of his next door neighbor. Today we have over 35 kids at McLaren who have committed homicide-related offenses. Murder, manslaughter, attempted murder, that type of thing. The complete profile, the profile of the complete population of McLaren and Hillcrest has changed to where it's 93% felony commitments, and 65% are Class A, person-to-person felonies.
So in effect, whether we like it or not, McLaren and Hillcrest have become juvenile versions of the Department of Corrections, that is, institutions for violent offenders. Is that fair to say?
That's very fair to say. And that is a recent phenomenon. I would say up until the early and mid-'80s, it was not that way. We still had a number of property offenders, and we still do. We have some. But there were a lot of kids who were committed to us for simply out of parental control, runaway. Those are what we call status offenses, and we haven't seen those kids in 15 years.
Are we missing the boat by not having at the state level some programs that are available for stronger intervention much earlier with wayward youth? Are we displacing those kids that we might well serve by having to focus on these more violent offenders?
I think the key to that question is state level, and I have to answer no. I think that has to be a county responsibility, not the state's responsibility at the early intervention level. And yes, we're missing the boat because the counties don't have the resources right now to do that either. But if we could redesign our system so that there's more accountability at the younger ages, at the first time a child becomes delinquent, and have a certainty and a meaningful consequence at that point, and had the resources to do that, I think we would be more effective.
Do you see any prospects for the state and the counties joining together in some sort of a venture where we might say, as the state, as the legislature, for example, well, we're going to provide you with facilities for more camps, for more programs for these earlier or younger youth who are at risk but haven't gotten into the violent crime syndrome yet, to try to encourage counties to do more?
I hope so. We did some of that in 1985. We did what's called the downsizing of McLaren, and the theory at the time was to take offline certain institutional beds, convert those beds into dollars, and give those dollars to the county juvenile departments. At the time it was about $6 million, and that was 1985. Well, we really haven't added to that pot in that length of time. Nor have we added any new beds at McLaren. So it was a good idea at the time to downsize the institution, to get the money into the community so they can reach kids at a younger age. The problem is we didn't invest in that model after we designed it. We didn't add any beds, and we didn't add any community resources, and we didn't give any more money to the counties. So now, because the gangs have come into Oregon, because the number of juvenile sex offenders is gone off the charts, we have a system that's overloaded with violent offenders, and we don't have the resources at either the state level or the county level to deal with it.
I'll mention to our audience for a moment that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, your host, and our guest today is Rick Hill, who is the Acting Director of the Juvenile Corrections Operation in the Children's Services Division. If you ever have any questions or concerns, feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon 97310. We're always happy to hear from you. Picking up on the topic of juvenile corrections, which we've been focusing on because of your position, in terms of the resource allocation, then, we have not had a real delivery of resources to implement some of the original ideas. How are we going to address that challenge as we go into the next session?
Well, the governor has mentioned in her State of the State address that juvenile violence is a very, very important issue and will be a major part of the budget building exercise we're about to embark on. As well, she's appointed Ted Kulongowski, the Attorney General, to set up a very thorough task force looking at the entire juvenile justice system and seeing if there aren't ways to make it more efficient. But in order to get credibility back, I think, with the people, with the taxpayer, we have to address public safety, and we have to deal right now with some of the kids who are simply walking free, who are not being held accountable for what they're doing. So we are going to have to get some additional hard beds from someplace, and we're going to have to do it rather quickly. In addition, we have to come up with better ways of distributing the money to the counties, who are the people who get to the kids at the very earliest level.
Should we be implementing some sort of a state program to provide camp facilities, additional camp facilities, and you might want to tell us a little bit about how that works, some sort of intermediate facilities that aren't available right now?
Every juvenile doesn't have to be locked up behind bars. We have some very, very successful community programs that the state operates and some that we contract for with the private sector. Our camp programs have been around for 35 years, and it's a secret that probably shouldn't be a secret. These started in an agreement we had with the Oregon State Parks Department, and we would send a whole cottage full of kids out to a location in Oregon, build a building, and then have all these kids work for the Oregon State Parks Department. And they have built many of the Oregon parks on the Oregon coast, as well as in eastern Oregon and other parts of the state. Alternating weeks, the kids go to school in the camp. So they're called work-study camps. It's $1 very, very well invested, because these camps cost about half what it would to keep them at McLaren. The money that is paid to the kids comes from the State Parks Department. It's much cheaper to employ our kids than it would be the normal parks worker. And the money the kids earn goes back to paying victim restitution for the crimes they committed. So they're ideal programs. The problem with them is that it's hard to get them cited. It's the not in my backyard syndrome. We tried to cite one about 15 years ago in Lapine and ended up citing it in Hillgard, which is just this side of La Grande. And that's as close as we could come to the valley with those programs. So they're good ideas, good programs, and we need to have more of them. It's very hard to get them cited.
What if we limited the camps to nonviolent offenders by statute and cited them by statute, the way we did prisons, actually, and the way we kind of overrode land use regulations and just said, we're going to do it, thank you very much, and we're going to make some decisions in the legislature about citing, although we had community input and all of that, but we gave it a fast track on the land use side. Would there be any prospects to, say, have a comprehensive bill to put together camps and a camp program with funding and just say, this will be for property offenders, to sell it to the communities?
I think you'd have to limit it to first-time property offenders to get the community buy-in. I think there's a great deal of fear out there now with toward the violent juvenile offenders, And I think it's that kind of leadership and that kind of thinking that will help us get to the bottom of this problem. Absolutely.
Well, one of the things that Ted Kulongowski will be looking at with his task force, as I understand it, is a two-tier juvenile correction system, meaning one tier being intervention with youth at risk who aren't into the violent crime syndrome, and another being a much tougher tier to intervene with the violent youth. Do you have any thoughts on that approach?
Well, it's interesting. We have some of our best results, some of our best recidivism numbers, the lowest percentages of recidivism among the most violent juvenile offenders. And the reason is that we keep the violent offenders at the programs at McLaren and Hillcrest. We keep them for as long as it takes. If a kid comes to us for a homicide at age 14, we can work with that kid for 7 years up till his 21st birthday. On a rape 1 charge, a 16-year-old, we will have that kid until he has completed sex offender treatment or until he's 21 years old. That's a great deal of time to work with a young person. Unfortunately, because our capacity is limited statutorily, we cannot deal with the property offenders. We cannot deal with the burglars and the auto thefts. They come and go real quickly. They're the ones in the revolving door. They're the ones that are going to have to be addressed out in the community programs.
Well, as we talk about statutory caps, we had a bill last session, HB 2630, that partially addressed the issue. Can you talk a little bit about the statutory cap and what we've been trying to do?
The cap was set in 1985 at an arbitrary number of 513 beds, and that includes the space at McLaren, Hillcrest, and the camps. That had remained unchanged until 1993. And it was House Bill 2630 that you sponsored that allowed the cap to flex with the state's population. So as the state's 0 to 17 age population goes up, so will the cap. And unfortunately, we didn't get any dollars attached to that bill last session, but we do intend to go to the emergency board next month and ask for the funding for those beds. And that will net us an additional 9 beds this year and an additional 9 or 10 beds in January of 1995. So the process has begun to add back some of the resource that we lost. We had started with 750 beds in the juvenile system in 1985. We took a 200 and some bed reduction. During the same time period in the adult system, they went from about 2,800 beds to over 6,500 beds over that same time period where we were going the other way.
I'll mention to our guests again, or rather our audience, that our guest is Rick Hill, and you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem. I'm your host. And if at any time you have any questions or concerns, I hope you'll feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. We're always happy to hear from you. Back to this issue of the caps, the limitations on capacity, and the dramatic reduction in capacity for juvenile corrections while we're increasing capacity for adult corrections. As part of the remedy, we also, in this bill we were talking about, said that the adult remand offenders would not be counted. An adult remand are juveniles who were tried in adult court by a decision to remand them to adult court, but they're still under the jurisdiction of the juvenile correction system. Now, does that help too?
That has helped tremendously, and we were given resources to add 1 living unit at McLaren for those remanded youth, and that's up and running, and it's a very successful unit. The number of remanded youth, however, is increasing, and that's in direct response to the escalation of juvenile violent crimes in this state. But the whole remand issue is being addressed not only by the Kulongowski Task Force, but also by the House Interim Task Force on Juvenile Justice.
I happen to serve on that task force, so I get to deal with that issue. And of course, I also happen to have an opinion on the issue, but which is that certain violent offenders ought to be remanded to adult court for trial, which would certainly give us longer-term jurisdiction over them, because your jurisdiction wouldn't end at the age of 21. But there's a point here that a lot of folks seem to overlook, which is that doesn't mean that the offenders have to be incarcerated in an adult prison. And we've talked a little bit about this, not during the show, but at other times, in terms of your opportunity to work with the offenders. Could you comment on how important it is to still have a real active involvement with these offenders, even though they may have committed violent crimes and be tried as adults, on what's really important after you pass that trial stage?
Well, again, we have our best success with the violent offenders in the juvenile system. We did a crossover study or a recidivism study, which of the kids that we had worked with at McLaren show up in the adult prison system in Oregon up to 8 years later. And we were shocked to find out that the number is very low. It's less than 39% of the kids that we have worked with as juveniles show up over in the adult system. And for the most serious violent crime categories, it's much lower than that. The thing about remand that people need to understand is adult court, it sounds tough, it sounds adult, but in fact it has some elements that juvenile court does not have. One of them is a jury trial, and juries can do anything. As we witnessed with the case in Lake Oswego last year, a juvenile was tried in adult court and ended up with a relatively light sentence for a very, very serious crime. The other thing the adult court has is recog and bail, and those are not opportunities afforded to juveniles currently.
Pretrial release.
Right. If you look at states in the East who have gone to a lower, earlier remand age and have had time to study it, such as New York and Illinois and even Florida, they have found that changing the remand age and changing the crime categories doesn't do the job. You have to also account for a dispositional alternative. You've got to find a place for the kid. Oftentimes the adult judges and adult juries would put kids on probation or would simply put kids into overcrowded jails, and then they would be recogged or released very early to be back on the streets. In New York State, for example, 70% of the kids remanded to adult court ended up doing no time at all as compared to their counterparts back in the juvenile system. So it's an issue that has to be addressed, no question about it, but the whole issue has to be addressed, not just the threshold, but what are you going to do with the kid later?
Well, one of the things we need to deal with then is in terms of any implementation, is to make sure that the pretrial release on your own recognition, or recog as you say, and other issues such as disposition are addressed, which we can do through legislation. Of course, the question is whether or not we're willing to do so and to apply the resources. Talking about the whole direction of juvenile corrections and the gang issues, how did we get into this dynamic from your perspective?
I think the gang phenomenon took Oregon by surprise. I think it took all Western states by surprise. I have no explanation for it other than, it was transplanted from somewhere else. It came up the I-5 corridor. We were a state, as other Western states were, who found themselves in a mode of deinstitutionalizing young people, young offenders, and trying to move resources to the community, and bang, here comes gangs selling crack cocaine and an influx of weapons that were made instantly available to young people, and then the whole issue of increased number of sex offenders, and we just got hit like a truck, and we weren't ready, and we're still not sure how to respond to that. The first thing you do is add police officers. The second thing you do is add prosecutors, and then you've got to find some bed capacity for the people that you're arresting and prosecuting. And we're still trying to dig ourselves out of that. We also put about $3 million of seed money into the Multnomah County Juvenile Department to deal with that gang issue. And that has been fairly successful at curbing the number of commitments that come to the state from Multnomah County. But now we find the gang numbers are spreading into the suburbs and down the I-5 corridor and even into eastern Oregon. Today, 25% of our gang members committed to McLaren are from outside of Multnomah County. And the highest growth rate for gang membership is in Marion County.
Well, one of the observations, it seems to me, is that we should treat this like an epidemic. And if it was a medical epidemic, we'd first look, we apparently have a population which is not inoculated against this disease, and a population which is susceptible to it. And we have to accept that as a given. that we could try to do some inoculation now to try to prevent people from being susceptible and work with young kids. But in the meantime, with the at-risk population, we're going to have to intervene. Quarantine is one concept. That is, you take the worst cases, perhaps, and you put them into a detention program. But then there's the intermediate cases, and it seems like what you're talking about is some active way of reaching out to these youth. Are there going to be some proposals for the next legislative session along these lines, or is that something that Kulongoski's still working on with his task group?
I think the kinds of interventions you're mentioning are more local, community-based interventions and not necessarily the responsibility of the Oregon legislature. There's that saying that's become popular, it takes a whole village to raise a child, and that's just as true with the gang issue as anything else. You have to get way down into the families themselves and parenting classes, mentorships, increase recreation opportunities, increase youth activities, get senior citizens involved. They have a lot to offer into classrooms, elementary schools. Just spending 1 hour a week with an at-risk kid in the 3rd grade who may not have a father at home can make the difference with that kid staying with his family, maybe gaining some of the values from the mentor as opposed to simply joining a gang because he needs to belong to something.
Well, what you're telling us is we need a broad-based assault on this issue. There's no single solutions. In terms of that broad-based assault, what kind of role can the state play in backing up the county and city level programs so that they don't have to use up all their resources on the most violent and most difficult offenders? Do you have some suggestions?
We have what we call a 10-year plan for juvenile corrections, which builds 4 new regional, smaller but very secure facilities around the state. Not only do we need additional bed capacity, but we need to replace some of the capacity that we're now using. Many of the buildings at McLaren and Hillcrest and the camps were built in the 1940s. Some of them were built in the 1920s that we're still using today. We have had no new construction since 1966. So even if we stay with the capacity we have, we're going to need new facilities. What I think the state should do is to build the new facilities, build them regionally, get them out of Marion County. That allows local communities to retain some sense of ownership for these youth and make it more difficult for the counties to simply give the problem to the state. The state can help, they can run the facility, they can build the facility, but the kid needs to stay relatively close to home. He can still be secure and he can still receive the treatment we offer today, but it needs to be done at the local level.
What about helping school districts have their own kind of reform schools available, that is alternative schools? They're coming up with all kinds of neat titles, but basically a place to send the discipline problems so that the regular schools can focus on education and the other schools can focus on discipline. Should the state be involved in helping that kind of approach?
I think there's unlimited possibilities for new partnerships. The last session we developed a new partnership with the Department of Education. All of the educational responsibility now within McLaren and Hillcrest belongs to the Department of Education. That was done under Senate Bill 881, and that takes effect July 1 of this year. That gives them that responsibility. If we expand, they have to come in with the education for those kids as well. Now, they have an interest now in making sure that the kids that are still at the public school level at home don't enter into the correction system, and hopefully they'll be creative in helping local school districts set up alternative education programs. All these kids don't need to come to McLaren and Hillcrest. Some of them, many of them, can be dealt with in the community if the proper programs are in place.
So we'll need to be aggressive and creative as we try to tackle these problems. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll thank our audience for joining us. Our guest has been Rick Hill, Acting Director of Juvenile Corrections. Again, thank you for joining us on Capital Insight.